Everything about this company, the reputation, the clients, the growth, that's because of me. Lenora's been great at keep things organized, of course, but the real work? That's mine. Conrad Ashby said it with a smile. Easy, confident, the kind of smile a man wears when he doesn't realize what he's just done. The room laughed politely. Someone raised a glass. The quarterly dinner at the Merchant Club on King Street West was meant to celebrate a record year. 42 million in new contracts. 3 major partnerships locked in, the firm finally breaking into the Vancouver market. Conrad stood at the head of the table in a navy suit that cost more than most of the junior staff made in a month, and he spoke like a man recounting a solo climb. Lenora Ashby sat 3 seats to his left. She set down her fork very carefully. Not because she was angry, or not only because of that, but because if she didn't do something deliberate with her hands, she wasn't sure what they would do on their own. She had heard her husband dismiss her before. In passing, in private, in the half-joking way that isn't really joking. But not like this. Not in front of Douglas Whitmore, who ran the largest commercial real estate portfolio in southern Ontario. Not in front of Jerome Calloway, whose firm had become a client because of a connection Lenora had quietly cultivated for 2 years. Not in front of Quentin Mallory, who sat across the table with an unreadable expression and who had originally been Lenora's contact, her referral, her relationship. She looked at Conrad. He was already moving on, talking about Q1 projections, gesturing with his wineglass. She looked at Quentin. He looked back at her. He gave the smallest, most careful shake of his head, as if to say, "I heard that too." Lenora picked up her fork again. She ate the rest of her salmon. She said very little for the remainder of the evening, which nobody noticed, because they were used to her saying very little. That was one of the things Conrad had always appreciated about her. She wasn't loud about herself. She didn't need to be the center of attention. He had no idea how much that had cost her over the years. They drove home in silence. Not an angry silence. Conrad wasn't angry. He was in a good mood, loosened by wine and the warmth of a successful evening. He talked about the Vancouver deal the whole way up the Gardiner. Lenora watched the lake through the passenger window and said, at the right intervals, and thought about the 17 months she had spent building the Vancouver connection in the first place. It had started with a conference in Kelowna. Conrad hadn't been able to go. He'd had a conflict, something with a client in Montreal. So Lenora had gone alone, which was unusual enough that people remembered it. She'd met Arthur Brennan there, the kind of developer who didn't take meetings with anyone he hadn't been personally introduced to. Over the following year and a half, she had met Arthur for coffee 3 times, when he was in Toronto. She had sent him a handwritten note when his mother passed. She had read everything about his projects and asked him questions that showed she had actually been paying attention. When the time finally came and Conrad flew out to Vancouver for what he called the big pitch, Arthur had already decided. He'd decided because of Lenora. Conrad didn't know that. She had never told him. She'd introduced the connection and stepped back, which was what she always did. And Conrad had walked in and been charming and closed the deal, and come home talking about how he'd read the room perfectly. She hadn't corrected him. At the time, it hadn't seemed worth it. Now, driving up the Gardiner while he talked, she thought about all the times it hadn't seemed worth it, and how they had accumulated quietly like snow. She didn't sleep well that night. Conrad was asleep within minutes, which she did not resent. She didn't want to talk to him, not yet. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was not sad. She was not even angry, exactly. She was finished. Not finished with him, or not only that, finished with the arrangement. The invisible architecture she had spent 11 years building around his career, around his confidence, around the story he told himself about who he was and why he succeeded. She had been the foundation and he had been the building, and he had just stood in front of everyone they knew, and called himself a feat of engineering. She was finished being the foundation no one saw. In the morning she made coffee. 2 cups as always. She brought his upstairs and left it on the nightstand and went back to the kitchen, and sat with her own cup and her laptop and began to think about what precisely she was going to do. She had options. This was the first thing she made herself understand clearly. She had options. She wasn't starting from nothing. She had a business degree from Queen's that had been quietly gathering dust because it hadn't seemed necessary. Conrad's firm was growing. She was managing the household. They were building something together. She had contacts across 3 industries that Conrad didn't even know she had. She had a reputation, quiet but real, among the kind of people who paid attention. And she had 11 years of understanding exactly how Ashby Group operated, what held it together, and what would happen if those things stopped being held. She didn't make any decisions that morning. She just made a list. The first change was small. So small that Conrad didn't notice it for almost 2 weeks. Lenora had been for years the person who maintained what she privately thought of as the ecosystem, the birthday emails to clients that went out in Conrad's name, the thank you notes after meetings, the follow-up calls that she made from her own phone. positioning herself as just checking in on Conrad's behalf. The dinner reservations at the right places when the right people were in town. The background research on new potential clients that she compiled into summaries Conrad skimmed before meetings and believed he already knew. She had never been on the firm's payroll. She had never had a title. She had simply, over many years, become the connective tissue of a business that her husband believed he had built by instinct. She stopped, quietly, no announcement. She simply redirected her attention elsewhere. The birthday emails started going out late or not at all. Conrad didn't notice for the first week because he never sent them himself. The second week, a long-standing client named Arthur's colleague, Brent, called the main office to say he hadn't heard from anyone about the harbor project. Conrad's assistant, a young woman named Petra, who was not Lenora and who had never been told what Lenora actually did, had no information to give him. Conrad mentioned it to Lenora at dinner. "Did you hear anything about the harbor file?" "I wouldn't know," she said pleasantly. "That's not my department." He looked at her. "I thought you'd talked to Brent's team." "Not recently," she said and handed him the salad. The second sign came 8 days after that. A dinner that should have been booked for a Thursday. The kind of dinner that required a specific table at a specific restaurant. Because one of the guests kept halal and another was vegetarian, and the private room at Canoe had a sightline issue that Lenora had known about for 2 years, wasn't booked. Conrad's assistant didn't know about the dietary considerations. The dinner happened at the wrong restaurant. And it was fine, technically, but it wasn't what Conrad's clients were used to from him. Afterwards, he came home slightly off balance, in a way he couldn't quite name. He didn't say anything. He was too busy being slightly unsettled to figure out why. Meanwhile, Lenora had coffee with Quentin Mallory on a Wednesday afternoon, at a place in Yorkville she'd been going to for years. Quentin was the kind of person who noticed things. He had noticed at the King Street dinner what Conrad had said and what Lenora had done with her face when he said it. "I've been thinking about something," he told her, over a flat white she hadn't touched yet. "Tell me," she said. "There's a gap in the market for a firm that does what you do. What you actually do." He paused. "There's nobody in this city doing high-level relationship management and client development as a standalone service. The big firms all have it built in, badly. The small players don't know they need it. And the mid-market, the Conrads of the world, outsource it to their wives without knowing that's what they're doing." Lenora looked at him for a long moment. "You've been sitting on this. I've been watching," he said. "There's a difference." She picked up her coffee. "What would you need from me?" "A conversation," Quentin said. "A real one. About whether you'd want to build something." That conversation lasted 4 hours. They moved from the coffee shop to a quiet table at the back of a restaurant on Hazleton where nobody knew either of them particularly well. By the time Lenora drove home, she had the outline of a business plan in the notes app of her phone and a feeling in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not excitement, exactly, but the particular aliveness that comes from being taken seriously by someone who understands what you're worth. Conrad was in his home office when she got back. He called out without turning around from his monitor. "Did you remember to confirm Thursday?" "Thursday's your assistant's responsibility," she said, hanging up her coat. A pause. "I thought you were handling it." "I'm not anymore," she said. "I've got some things of my own I'm working on." She went upstairs. He didn't ask what things. It took another 3 weeks for the weight of her absence to become undeniable. There were 2 client relationships that began to cool. Not dramatically, not in any way Conrad could point to and name, but in the way that human warmth cools when the person providing it is no longer in the room. Lenora had been the warmth. She had been the memory that a client's daughter had just started university, the consideration that sent a bottle of wine when someone closed on a property, the voice that called to say, "Conrad wanted me to check in," when Conrad had not actually thought to check in at all. Without those things, his relationships with certain clients were revealed to be what they had always been: professional, competent, and not particularly warm. He noticed. He mentioned it to his assistant, who had no explanation. He mentioned it to a colleague, who said these things went in cycles. He did not mention it to Lenora, because in 11 years he had never connected the warmth to her, had never identified it as something she was doing on purpose. He thought of it as his way with people, his relationship style. He was only now beginning to understand that he had been borrowing it, and the lender had quietly stopped extending credit. One evening in March, gray wet, the kind of evening that makes Toronto feel like it's been going on forever, Conrad came into the kitchen to find Lenora at the table with her laptop and a yellow legal pad covered in notes. He noticed she was on a video call with someone he didn't recognize, a man with a British Columbia area code showing on the screen. She held up one finger a minute and finished the call. "Who was that?" he asked, not jealously, just as a reflex. "A potential client," she said. He waited for more. She didn't give him more. She flipped the legal pad to a blank page with a manner that was entirely pleasant, entirely composed, and somehow more final than a door closing. Client for what? Lenora looked at him, not coldly, she was never cold. But clearly I'm starting something, a consultancy. Relationship development and client management for mid-market firms. The silence that followed was the kind that has a shape. He put his hand on the counter. You never mentioned this? No, she said. I didn't. When did you? He stopped. Reorganized. Are you working with Quentin Mallory? Among others, yes. He was quiet for a long moment. Lenora watched him with patience and without apology. Why didn't you tell me you were thinking about this? She tilted her head very slightly, in the way she did when she was choosing her words. I've spent 11 years supporting your career, Conrad. I think I'm allowed to spend some time on my own without a briefing. That's not, he stopped again. That's not what I meant. I know, she said, not unkindly. He sat down across from her. He looked at the legal pad, at the laptop, at the notes she'd made that he couldn't read from where he was sitting. He looked at her, really looked, in the way he hadn't for a long time, or possibly ever, she thought. Not like this. The harbor situation, he said slowly. And the Morrison dinner. And Brent's call. She waited. Was that? Were you? I stopped doing things I was doing, she said, quietly, because I had things of my own to do. He leaned back in his chair, his face did something complicated. She had seen his face do many things over 11 years. Charming, confident, frustrated, pleased with himself. She hadn't seen this one very often. It looked like understanding arriving late to a room and not knowing quite where to sit. How much, he said, have you been doing? For the firm. That I didn't know about. Lenora was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was deciding how honest to be and then deciding to be fully honest. Because they were past the point where partial honesty served anyone. The Vancouver deal, she said. Arthur Brennan. That relationship was mine. I had been building it for 17 months before you walked into that meeting. He didn't say anything. Jerome Calloway. I've known his wife for 6 years through the hospital board. He came to you because I asked him to. He told me last year that the reason he stayed is because he felt like you genuinely cared about his people. She paused. I wrote the birthday note to his assistant when she had her baby. I called when his father was in the hospital. You sent the flowers I ordered. Conrad's jaw moved. The merchant dinner, she said. Not the recent one. She meant the first big one, 7 years ago, the one where 3 of their now largest clients had all been in the room together for the first time. You think that happened because of the King Street connection? It happened because I called Christine Osei 6 weeks before and suggested she bring her husband. Christine was the one who introduced you to Douglas. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands for a moment. When he looked up, he looked like a man who had been reading a building's blueprints for years and had just discovered there was an entire floor he'd never known about. Why, he said. Why didn't you tell me? I tried, Lenora said. 3 times in the first 2 years you were busy. Or you'd move on to what you wanted to talk about. Or you'd say something like, she kept her voice even, something like you're great at this stuff, you don't need to make it complicated. She looked at him. You didn't want to know. So I stopped trying to tell you. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it. And now you're leaving, he said. It was almost a question. I'm not leaving, she said. I'm changing the terms. He looked up. I'm building my own firm. That is happening. Quentin's on board as a partner and we already have 2 letters of intent. She let that settle before continuing. What happens with us, with this, that's a separate question. But it's not one I'm going to answer by staying invisible, not again. Conrad nodded slowly. It was a different kind of nod than she was used to from him, not the quick, decisive one he used in meetings when he'd already decided. This was the nod of a man encountering the actual shape of something he'd been living beside for years without seeing. I said something terrible at that dinner, he said. Yes, Lenora said. You did. In front of Quentin. In front of Douglas. He stopped. In front of Arthur's people. Yes, did you plan this before then, or? I had been thinking about it for a while, she said honestly. But that night clarified things. He was quiet. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the rain had started again, the kind of March rain in Toronto that doesn't know what it wants to be yet. Half ice, going nowhere. What do you need from me? He asked finally. 2, he seemed to be choosing words carefully for once. For us to move forward, if that's something you still want. Lenora looked at him for a long time. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before or hadn't let herself see, a genuine question. Not a pivot, not a negotiation, an actual question from a man who had finally realized he didn't know the answer. I need you to understand that this isn't a gesture, she said. I'm building something real, and it may end up being in direct competition with some of your clients in the long term, and that's not something I'm willing to walk back. I understand, he said. I need you to stop saying my name in rooms like a footnote. He winced, briefly, but she caught it. And I need you to actually want to know, she said. Not to know so you can manage it, but because you're genuinely curious about what I've been building and what I think and what I can do. She paused. I've been curious about your work for 11 years. I'd like some of that returned. Conrad Ashby sat across from his wife in their kitchen on a wet March evening and looked at her in the way he should have been looking at her for a very long time. Not as the person who kept things running, not as the warm presence in the background that made people like him by extension, but as a person in her own right, capable, deliberate, privately formidable, who had been making choices he hadn't even known were available to make. "Okay," he said. "That's not enough," she said, but not unkindly. "But it's a start." She turned back to her laptop. He stayed at the table. After a moment he asked if she wanted tea, and she said yes, and he got up and put the kettle on, and neither of them said anything for a while, which for the first time in a long time felt like something other than silence. 6 months later, Lenora Ashby, now Lenora Osei-Ashby on all professional materials, reclaiming her mother's family name in the way she had been meaning to do for years, opened the doors of Meridian Advisory Group in a bright corner office on Adelaide Street West. Quentin was there. 2 other founding partners were there. 4 clients were there on day 1. Conrad was there too, standing near the window with a coffee he'd poured from the catering table, looking around at what she had built with an expression that was careful and genuine and a little bit humbled. He had referred 2 clients to her himself, which she had not asked for and which she had accepted without making a point of it. The firm made its first major placement within 90 days. By the end of the year, Meridian had 11 ongoing retainer clients and a waiting list. At the holiday party in December, Quentin gave a short speech. He talked about the gap in the market, the clarity of vision that had launched the company, the quality of the work. He mentioned Lenora by name, specifically 3 times. Afterwards, at the coat check, Conrad handed Lenora her jacket. "He said your name more times in 5 minutes than I have in years," he said quietly. "Yes," Lenora said. "He did." They walked out together into the cold December evening, the city bright and loud around them, and Conrad reached for her hand and she let him take it. And they walked to the car without saying anything else. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, or not yet, but it was the shape of something that could become it if they kept choosing it deliberately, day after day, the way real things are built. Not in a single night, not with a single gesture, but the way she had always known things got done. Quietly, patiently, and with the full weight of someone who knows exactly what they're worth.